Hello everyone. Welcome to our program ديوانية نحن تراثنا. This program aims to host guests in fields related to culture and heritage. And today we're going to be talking about the new landscape of museums in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And to elaborate further on this topic, we have our guest, Dr. Stefano Carboni. He is the CEO of the Museum Commission. Dr. Stefano has an educational background in Arabic and Islamic arts, and he has 30 years of experience in the field of museums and art galleries. Welcome, Dr. Stefano.
My pleasure to be here.
It's our pleasure to have you today as our guest, and we look forward to talking about museums in Saudi Arabia. First of all, I would like to know further about Dr. Stefano.
You want me to introduce myself a bit? Well, as you can hear from my accent, which never changes, I'm from Italy originally, and I grew up in Venice, which is probably one of the most cultural cities in Italy, certainly, and in the world in general. And so I think that growing up in Venice actually helped my kind of art historical background, because Venice is a city that is exposed to several centuries of artistic heritage, including the contemporary, because as you may be aware, the famous Biennale of Venice is the oldest contemporary art festival, basically, that exists. So I grew up obviously in this type of environment. I decided that I wanted to study languages. And I think that I surprised my family when I said I wanted to study Arabic, because in Venice there is a good school of Oriental languages given the history of the place. And so I started university by studying Arabic, and I found a love almost immediately for the study of Islamic art. So I decided to become an art historian, using the language in a way in the service of Islamic art, and this is what I pursued basically after I graduated in Italy. I moved on to do my PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies of London University. At the same time, I spent some time in Cairo with a fellowship there, so I was immersed in an Arab country that helped me a lot, of course, to understand better culture and traditions.
So do you speak Arabic?
لا شوية
So we can switch the program to Arabic?
No, better not. Okay. But it would take quite a long time. But no, I can understand, and especially Amiya from Masr would be the dialect that I can understand better. Here you speak quite a different dialect, and I have to get used to that. But so after I finished my PhD in London in Islamic art and archaeology, I was offered a position at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and I became a museum person, basically. I became a curator, and all my career in New York, 16 years, from 92 to 2008, was as a curator, an administrator, a writer, an educator in the field of Islamic art. And at the same time, because of my kind of academic inclinations, I enjoyed writing and contributing to the field. I also taught several courses at the Bar Graduate Center for the Decorative Arts, Hunter College, and IFA. So I try to maintain my balance between being a curator and an academic, but what was great about that was that I could take my students to the storerooms of the Metropolitan Museum of my exactly, and so it was a live encounter with the works. That doesn't happen very often, because usually you study on slides and books. So that helped a lot. And then I decided that it was time to move on in my career. And because at that point I had embraced the fact that I was a museum person, and I wanted really to make a difference in the museum world, regardless of my specialization, if you wish. I wanted to pursue a more managerial leadership career. And it so happened that I was offered the position of director and CEO of the Art Gallery of Western Australia. So from New York, I moved all the way to the other side of the world, Western Australia. This is also for personal reasons, because my family, my wife grew up in Australia, so it was a way to go closer to one side of the family. And so from 2008 to 2019, I was a director, basically, of a modern and contemporary art museum, a public museum, a public institution. So that's really what I assume prepared me for the position that I'm holding now, which is the CEO of the Museums Commission for the Ministry of Culture, in an exciting moment in the history, I think, of cultural life here in the kingdom. And for me, it's a new adventure, if you wish. It's a new challenge and something that I have fully embraced.
Can you tell us, how did that happen? How did you become the CEO of the museum?
How I became, well, to tell you the truth, after when I was about to finish my tenure at the Art Gallery of Western Australia, I thought that the remainder of my career would be academic. I had already accepted a fellowship at the University of Melbourne, and I was basically speaking with the faculty there and the dean of the faculty about the possibility of having a professorship in Islamic art there, when I was approached by a headhunter regarding this position. And at the beginning, I don't think that I was interested to the point of wanting to pursue it. But then when this headhunter started to tell me a bit about the background, about the fact that the Ministry of Culture had been established very recently, that there was, she obviously was talking to me about the Vision 2030 for the kingdom, the fact that all cultural sectors would be propped up and encouraged by the kingdom, basically. Little by little, she convinced me that why not having a conversation. And this is how it happened, basically. I was invited for some conversations initially, and then and I assumed that my background was a good mix of having been an academic, a curator, a director, having worked in government for the past 10 years, so with a better understanding of the complexities of working in government. And also, I think that one of the important points that we discussed during the interviews with His Excellency the Vice Minister and several other senior members of the ministry, I really wanted to point out that I would interpret my job as a mentoring job rather than a kind of boss coming in and trying to do everything that needs to be done. And so I think that this was one of the key decisions when they offered me the position, that my understanding is that obviously they would have offered the position to a Saudi if there was someone in the country who would fit entirely the profile. And so it was a privilege for me, of course, to be selected as the best candidate for the position. And it took quite a while, I must say, before I made a decision, because it was a big decision, of course, to kind of leave the family behind in order to come here and take this position. But I do believe that it's an important moment in the history of this kingdom, and if we can move the museums of the country in a direction that is at international standards, my job will be done. And when I feel that I've mentored enough people, that's it. I will move aside.
That's great. Okay, so the Museum Commissions was established. No, sorry. From your experience here, and I think the Museum Commission has been here for a year and a half almost?
A little less. Technically, it's a commission because there is a board, right? So it's technically not, strictly speaking, a department within the ministry, but a commission with a board. So the board was established, I don't remember exactly, but about a year ago was appointed. So technically, it's about 1 year, yes.
So within this year, has the Commission been able to analyze the situation of museums in Saudi Arabia?
Well, that's if I have to speak about the mandate that I have in a few words, yes, half of it would be assessing the current situation and try to improve it to the point of bringing it to good standards, international standards, best practice. And the other half would be identifying the gaps and try to fill them before 2030 arrives. So now, told in a few words, sounds almost simple, right? Yeah. But it's, as you can imagine, it really has to include so many areas of development. And the assessment, of course, was one of the most important things to do immediately. The Commission started only with me. So that's how, from the strategic point of view, the ministry wants to develop the commissions. They selected the CEO. The CEO would work with the consultants initially in order to establish a proper organizational chart, a proper development of how the commission is going to work. And so a year later, I have a few staff, but still we are working on a number of strategic goals that will be all incorporated eventually. But that doesn't mean we're being idle, obviously, because a lot of assessment needed to be done. And a lot of new initiatives have been started. And as you can imagine, delivering a museum is not from one day. It's not like I don't know, a festival, a biennale, or a short-term event. It has to be done with a proper understanding of what a museum is, starting with a mission, starting with a vision, starting with a collection, right? Because a museum is, after all, a collecting institution that is open to the public, right? So if you don't have these two things, you cannot say that it's a must-have, basically, right? And so the current assessment shows that the landscape is at the very beginning, literally. It hasn't developed to a high standard in the past decades, which is not a criticism necessarily, but definitely I see my main role to try to establish standards and a culture that is slightly different from what has been done before. And as you can imagine, it's not going to be an easy task. We started, if you wish, by assessing the National Museum, which is obviously the biggest institution and the flagship institution that 20 years ago, when it opened, was a fabulous new institution at the level of international standards. But unfortunately, it still looks a little bit like it was 20 years ago, because not a lot of progressive changes. It hasn't kept in touch with the most recent development in museology and museological studies. And so it was important to try to give it a push almost immediately. And that's what we have already done. The National Museum now has a very important board that it didn't have before. And so it's regulated in a different way, and the board is going to be serious in managing it. And one of the first actions that I took upon myself, asking the board permission, I basically acted as an interim CEO, also for the board of the National Museum, in order to ask the board to hire a new director, basically. And I did the search, and I was very happy that we could hire a Saudi. First of all, I think it was an important thing, and also the first female director that the museum has had. So we were very satisfied with the choice, and the new director, Leila Fadah, has started already a couple of months ago, and now she is obviously looking at delivering a new vision for the museum, obviously with the strong support of the Museums Commission that is going to oversee basically all the museums in the kingdom.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to be something amazing, and we look forward to seeing that. As the Saudi Heritage Preservation Society talks about heritage,
yes,
can you elaborate further the connection between heritage and museums?
That's an interesting question, I think. I think that it also depends on what is your interpretation of the word heritage. Is it turath?
Yeah.
You would, if you had to say it in Arabic, it would be turath, I assume, right? So the meaning of the root waratha, right, is that of a legacy, a kind of inheritance. So, okay, so let's talk about heritage as something from the past, right, that you want to preserve. Okay, so in this respect, a museum as a collecting institution of material culture of any kind of the past, or one of the mandates of the museums is to collect, collect, interpret, display and interpret objects from the past in order to tell stories, right? In order to have a narrative that the public can understand, can enjoy, can learn from. So in this respect, it's a clear connection between heritage and museums. But museums as collecting institutions can be contemporary art museums, right? So the engagement would be with works of art, if we talk about a contemporary art museum, with works that are made by living artists and that are very current, right? So is that heritage? Does it become heritage in the moment it enters the museum, because it becomes a thing of the past? The concept is a little vague, I think. But what is important to say, I believe, is that a museum has to be a current, lively, complex institution that caters to the people, and the people live today, right? So the people are interested in heritage, right? But they're also interested in understanding how the world works today, and museums can help with that and make it very relevant, actually, to the history of the past, if you wish, as well, but also the present. So I don't know if I answered your question, but no, it's complicated, I think.
When you say that museums has to attract people, visitors of the museum, how do you keep them coming? What are the issues that faces museums in attracting visitors in enough numbers to sustain the museum on a long term?
Oh, sure. Well, one thing is talking about visitation, and this is certainly one of the key issues, I believe, that we have assessed in this country. There is a distance that a lot of people keep from museums, and when you say the word متحف, for a lot of people it is an old stuffy place, right? And it's true, because it is true that often it is an old stuffy place where you go around, you see a lot of things on the shelves in the cases, very little interpretation, so you leave the place saying, oh yeah, I've seen a lot of things, but it's not that I've learned much, right? Museums today need to be engaging, otherwise there's no point, and need to tell stories. I think that's the best way to put it, because it's only by telling stories that people become interested in what is being said, in what the objects that are on view are saying to them, right? So this is in terms of visitation, we know there are statistics, but they're not entirely reliable. So we will have to start all over again. There are now a number of companies that are completely experienced in audience research, audience segmentation, audience outreach, and audience retainment when they come. So definitely we will need to bring in this type of expertise in order, first of all, to establish what people want and why they are not coming to the museums at the moment. Then how can we attract them by creating programs within the museums that are current and relevant and people enjoy and can interact with in a fun way and not in a boring way. So it's an educational tool that you need to make sure is also enjoyable. And once they come in, they have to leave feeling that they had a good experience. And that's when you start to have repeat visits, right? It's the word of mouth. It's bringing your family next time, so that that's more people. But it has to go hand in hand with the fact that the museums must offer new things, even if it's only a new exhibition or a new program or a new whatever, or a new menu in the restaurant, in the cafe that you have there. So that people feel that, okay, 3 months later I can go back to the museum because I can have something different. That's what is very, very important to do in this country, to make people feel comfortable to go to museums so that they can have repeat visits. Then, of course, you have the other equation, which is the development of tourism in this country, which is another big push that the kingdom is doing. But this is basically related to the unique visitor, right? Single visit to the museum, because it's the tourist that, if the museum is well established and it is well marketed and has good reviews, then it has more chances that it gets the attention of the tourist and is going to be visited. And then the word of mouth obviously becomes very important in terms of visitation from foreigners who will have a much better understanding of the culture of Saudi Arabia, of course, because the majority of museums here would show this to the non-Saudis. So it is a combination really of targeting repeat visits and unique visits.
You mentioned contemporary art museums. Like in Saudi Arabia, having 13 different provinces and different cultures in Saudi Arabia, what type of museums do you think can become in Saudi Arabia?
When we think about the second part of my mandate, which is identify the gaps and try to fill them, if you think of the museums that are now around the country, and there aren't many, right? And the majority would be museums that can be described as heritage museums, right? So the word heritage coming back, which means that it's a bit of a mix, and the National Museum is a good example. It's a bit of a mix of natural history, to start with, the first gallery in the National Museum, natural history and the history of starting from prehistoric times and the Paleolithic and all this. And then you move into the Bronze Age, you have archaeological material that starts to come in, but then the museum becomes more of a historical museum, because it's, especially when you start with the period of the Prophet Muhammad and Islamic art and Islamic culture, then there is a strong focus on that, rightly so. And then you move into the most recent history, which is the history of the House of Saud, of course. So this is all punctuated by the fact that it's all about objects that demonstrate the history of this place, which is a perfectly good approach. But the great majority have the same approach. So what we don't have in this country is what we call specialized museums. So museums that would have a more narrow focus that around the world is the case, not only in very developed countries, but also in countries that are developing now. So they try to have the Museum of Contemporary Art, they try to have a Museum of Natural History, they try to have, in this case, a Museum of Islamic Art is a bit of a no-brainer, I think.
Yeah.
But anyway, to see how, and you can go into very, very detailed collection building institutions that can be large and small, can be more educational, more of centers and with little collecting, but you could have everything related to it. And we are working on developing quite a good number of these specialized museums. At the same time, I have to say as well that we are developing quite a good number of regional museums. And by regional museums, what I really believe we have to do is that they shouldn't be the only, at least, the same development that we have in the National Museum, this kind of heritage approach, but definitely because they are in the regions and they are in cities where communities are very active, you have good artistic communities as well, we need to make them relevant for the locals, because in some areas tourists probably wouldn't be very present. So you need really to engage the community, to engage local artists in order to participate in the life of the museum.
Having regional museums, do you think raising the awareness of the communities, as you mentioned, in terms of how to create some private museums in collaboration with the Museum Commission, do you think that's a possibility? There can be training to people to be able to make private museums that are up to standards?
Yes, well, obviously, by private museums, I assume we mean private collections, so individuals, citizens who have been collecting whatever, whatever you wish, heritage usually, it's a bit of everything, who have registered their name with what was previously the SCTH, the Saudi Commission for Tourism and Heritage, then Ministry of Tourism. So this is a good way to understand how many private museums. But the main point is that, yes, a lot of them wouldn't be up to great standards. And if we want to create private museums, which are important to the landscape, of course, because it all contributes to make the landscape being very exciting, we need to train them up, basically. We need to make sure that they have an understanding that there is a vision for what they do, and a museum is not a private collection anymore if you want it to become a museum, but it becomes a tool for the public to understand, obviously, the history of the private collection in itself, of the owner and all this, but of the content as well. So one of the things that definitely the Museums Commission would like to do is to establish a very strong network that will allow private museums to interact, to talk to each other, and to talk, of course, also to the Museums Commission. So I see the Museums Commission as having a supporting role in this respect, and in trying to mentor them to raise the standards in order to make sure that whoever visits them are happy with what they see. Obviously, the main mandate of the Museums Commission is to work on the public museums. That's the main thing that we do.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's really interesting, and talking to you brings out questions that we didn't
that
hope
you don't
for.
have in your list.
But
okay.
If we can say, Saudi has a lot of historical sites, which in result have a lot of archaeological findings and gatherings. So do you think like building museums in a way where it's more interactive with the sites than actually having these collections in buildings? What's your opinion on that?
Absolutely. That's all part of telling the story, right? Because if you look, and obviously the archaeological site is not the domain of the Museum Commission, it's the domain of the Heritage Commission. But if you think of the story of a work that the archaeologists dig And the idea is that that object tells you something, right? You know, the archaeologists put it together, the academics make the story start to come true, and the object is conserved, is prepared in a way that can be eventually exhibited, right? So the journey of this object, of these archaeological objects, starts obviously from the ground, but ends in the museum, right? And so it's absolutely important that there is a strong bond between what the Heritage Commission does and what the Museums Commission does, because it's in the museum that then the story comes alive, because the curators and because the educators have the tools to tell the story in a way that is up to the international standards and engage the public in that way. So the object starts in one place, but the final place is actually in the museum. So,
But maybe what I meant was like in Italy, in Pompeii, where you have the open museums.
In this case, absolutely, yes, you can call it an open museum, and it's true, but then you have also the closed museum where the objects are on display and all this. But yes, if there are archaeological sites here where you can actually walk around like Dumet Gendel, it's a wonderful experience, and this is ideal, if you wish, in terms of the way museums interact with the archaeological site, because the new regional museum in Al Juf is actually on the site of Dumet Gendel. And so it will be absolutely fundamental that the story is narrated within the museum with the objects, but then, or before, it doesn't matter, the people, the visitors can visit the site. I guess that it would be better if the visitors start to learn what the site is and then they visit it, because it can come alive in a better way. But this is what obviously we will need to do in many sites. I think that Najran is another example of a regional museum that is being built, it's almost finished, next to an archaeological site, and so they need to be connected.
And I think the history of Saudi Arabia, it goes back to a really...
there are discoveries, and I certainly cannot speak for this, but I think that so little has been unearthed so far that the next decades of archaeological digs are going to tell a very, very interesting story of the connections between the kind of Middle Eastern or northern, north of the peninsula interactions, and how the Arabian Peninsula was basically linking also with the south and the maritime trade. So I think that we know very little yet of what stories can be told, and very active, and the Heritage Commission, I know that they're being very active.
I think with all the projects and giga projects happening in Saudi, a lot of discoveries are going to be happening, and so you guys are going to be very busy.
Yes, and then we have to build new museums, right?
True.
In order to
I think that's the beauty of having museums. You have the history, and you have the sites, and you have the collections, and then the museum's part is to tell the story of all of this history.
Exactly, in a relevant way, in a way that is relevant to the contemporary public.
And I think it's important to have this for the future generations, to know this history and to be willing to go into the museums and be active with
Exactly. Obviously, it's the new generations that need to be hooked into it, and it's also, from my point of view, we need to create, and we're talking obviously about the young generation in this case, we need to make sure that we create the first generation of museum specialists, basically. That's a very important part of what the Museums Commission needs to deliver. We need museum specialists, not only curators and directors and conservators, but we need registrars, we need exhibition designers, we need installers, we need technicians. So that's what we hope to be able to deliver in the next few years.
So I guess you answered my questions. What are the hopes and aspirations for the Heritage Commission in the upcoming years?
Yes, I think that we have covered a few things, but the aspirations are many and very ambitious, I believe, and I think we should be very ambitious. This is a big country, and it needs to be a leader in this field, in the field of museology in the Middle East.
Okay, I think we can start taking questions from
I see. Okay.
our... Okay, first question is how to extend virtual museums, to what extent do virtual museums take a place shortly? To how the question.
So it's a question about virtual museums.
Yeah.
Yes, it's obviously a relevant question, especially in a COVID era. And it's a debate that is obviously very, very common among all museum directors, all curators and all this. We need to make use of digital technologies as much as possible in order to create the opportunity, especially in a post-COVID era, to make the physical visits to museums very relevant. So I do believe that the virtual museum in itself is not enough, right? But the virtual museum is going to be very important to have a better understanding of what the collection is, so that when you go and visit the place, the museum, you can enjoy it much more. So digital means and virtual journeys are important in order to attract people to the subject, and they are important as well to understand if people enjoyed their visit, so in order to basically build up a full understanding of what needs to be done and what we already do well. So fully agree with digital technologies, but still we want people to go to the museums.
True. I think the digitization now is
it's a big, absolutely, it's a big deal. Yeah.
Okay, someone is asking, in your opinion, how will the Museum Commission support private museums?
Well, again, I think that I have already answered this question before. The focus of the Museums Commission is on the public institutions. There's no question. We need not only to improve the existing ones, but we need to create new ones in order to fill the landscape. Private collections that become private museums will be licensed by new licenses that the Museums Commission will develop at good international standards. We will interact, we will support all the private collectors who want to become private museums, but also we need to understand that these must be museums that are accessible to the public. Otherwise they stay private collections, right?
So I think this question is linked to your answer, and will there be an evaluation of private museums for it to be licensed?
We'll be working on assessing the current licenses that exist and certainly come up with improved tools in order to make sure that the private museums are at a good standard. In terms of, as I said before, a museum is a collecting institution that is open to the public. It means that it needs to have a purpose, it needs to have a vision, and that's what probably we're going to ask to the private collectors. Give us your vision, and then we can talk.
True. Okay, someone is asking, what are the challenges that are being faced in the development of museum-going culture? I think about visitors and
about visitors.
Yeah, and what are the challenges that that face people when going to the museums or the development?
Well, I think that as I said before, what is important is that we deliver on the promise of making the experience a good one, because if we don't do it, people will actually be turned off and they won't come again. So it's important that we change the way visits are perceived, but we need to deliver on them, otherwise it's not going to work.
True. Do you think education can play a significant role in encouraging museum movements in Saudi Arabia?
Education as in education outside the museums or education.
I think we can talk about both aspects. Yani we have education inside museums and we have education in universities about museums.
Yes, exactly. So I think we can go back to what I was mentioning before. A strong part of what a museum does is educational, right? Because you need to create the programs that people will enjoy. It's about interpretation of the objects, it's about the stories that are told, it's about understanding the different needs, right? It's not only about children versus teenagers versus adults, right? It's also about what people want, what people need from educational programs in museums. So from that point of view, definitely we need to improve dramatically the way educational programs are done in museums, using all the more appropriate tools. And then, of course, in higher educational facilities, in higher education, in universities, we need to start creating courses that are specific to museum studies, museum business, curatorial studies, conservation, of course, so that, as I mentioned before, we start creating the first generation of museum specialists.
Sure. Okay. There's a misconception among museums in different cultures. What are our roles to do? I'm not sure what this question is. Okay, I think we covered all the questions and we took all the questions. Is there something, Dr. Stefano, that you want to add to to this? Yani we have people, let's say all of our viewers are mostly people interested in heritage, culture, museums, and Saudi Arabia in general. So what is your message, Dr. Stefano, from your experience being in Saudi, being in museums, studying the situation of museums in Saudi Arabia? What can you tell us as a final message to our viewers?
I think that one thing is kind of watch this space while we move forward with our initiatives, our plans and all this. As I mentioned at the very beginning, delivering a museum is a kind of almost invisible journey until you open to the public, and then it kind of explodes, right, because it becomes public.
Is there a time frame for a museum to be built?
Well, it depends on the size and everything, but you know, in my own development of museums, I think we have 13 steps, and each step is a very important one, from the vision and mission to building the collection to thinking about what this building is going to look like, to governance, staffing, income generation, kind of a business model for it and all this. So it takes quite a while, especially if it's a major institution. And you probably know about international standards. What about the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi, right?
Yeah.
It's already, 15 years from the very beginning in which they started to negotiate how to do it. So museums of this magnitude need a lot of years in order to be delivered. But I guess I don't have that time, because 2030 is really the deadline, right? And so we have to make sure that they are on a track that will allow us to stagger the delivery of these institutions over time in an exciting way. We know that we need at some point to become visible, so obviously it's important that marketing communication is going to pick up at some point. We are working on a number of things. Probably so far we've been working very much behind the scenes, and we haven't had a lot of public attention because we cannot deliver immediately, but hopefully this is going to pick up. And so I would say my message is be patient. We are working and we'll be there very
silently
soon.
But strongly.
Exactly, yeah.
Since you mentioned the 2030 vision, can you just highlight what is the scope of in the vision? What is the KPI that you are targeting to achieve by 2030?
Oh, I don't have the numbers with me, but obviously the KPIs are going to be related to the number of new institutions or the total landscape that we can create. It's going to be related to the contribution in monetary terms, in financial terms, that the sector can deliver. The number of employees in the sector. So we have very ambitious targets, but we're not ready to deliver them, to go public with them
Go
yet.
public with
So,
them.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for being our guest on the show. It was an honor, and I enjoyed speaking to you, Dr. ستيفانو. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in with us, and until next time for the next Dewaniya.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.